Vladimir Putin publicly admitted today that Russia is indeed helping Iran with intelligence to target American military personnel in the Middle East and immediately offered Donald Trump a deal. Despite the fact that earlier the White House claimed they had supposedly asked the Kremlin not to help Iran in the war and that the Kremlin had agreed, today it became known that Russia offered the US a deal. Moscow will stop providing Iran with intelligence data, including the coordinates of American military facilities in the Middle East, if Washington suspends the supply of intelligence to Ukraine. And this happened after Trump eased sanctions on Russian oil, stated that it was supposedly Ukraine who was disrupting the negotiations, and the Kremlin directly announced that the trilateral talks with Ukraine and the US have been put on hold. And this is where things start to get really interesting. Against the backdrop of the war in Iran, Russia is doing everything it can to gain the trust of the United States and get involved in the war, thereby pushing the issue of Ukraine into the background. My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start this episode, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the episode, and leave any comment under this video. In addition, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechiy News. The link is in the description. There we post breaking news as it comes in. So, contrary to the statements of Donald Trump and his friend Stephen Witkoff, Moscow offered the US a deal under which the Kremlin would stop sharing intelligence information with Iran, such as the exact coordinates of American military facilities in the Middle East, if Washington stops providing Ukraine with intelligence data about Russia. Two sources familiar with the course of US-Russian negotiations told the publication Politico that such a proposal was made by the Russian envoy Kirill Dmitriev to the envoys of the Trump administration, to Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner during their meeting last week in Miami. By the way, this was when Stephen Witkoff, with a straight face, claimed that he asked Russia not to share intelligence with Iran, and the Kremlin allegedly promised him they wouldn't do it. And, as you remember, Steve Witkoff said, well, we take them at their word. But later, evidence emerged that Russia not only continued to share intelligence, but also started supplying weapons to the Iranian regime. Nevertheless, Politico claims that the US rejected the Russians' proposal, but the very fact that such a proposal existed caused concern among European diplomats who fear that Moscow is trying to drive a wedge between Europe and the US at a critical moment for transatlantic relations. US President Donald Trump today expressed outrage over NATO allies' refusal to send warships to the Strait of Hormuz. Today he called his NATO allies cowards and said, "We will remember this." One of the European Union diplomats called the Russian proposal outrageous. And the proposed deal is likely to increase the growing suspicion in Europe. These semi-closed meetings between Stephen Witkoff and Kirill Dmitriev do not lead to concrete progress in reaching a peace agreement on Ukraine, but are seen by Moscow as an opportunity to lure Donald Trump's team into a deal between the two powers that would simply leave Ukraine and Europe on the sidelines. By the way, this is exactly what Putin has been striving for since the first days of Trump's presidency: to reduce any negotiations to a bilateral format, meaning Trump-Putin, and to divide the world. And here is a telling moment. The day before, the Kremlin announced that the peaceful trilateral negotiations on Ukraine, mediated by the US, have been suspended. This was stated by the press secretary of the Russian dictator, Dmitry Peskov. Next is his quote, "This is a situational pause for understandable reasons. Therefore, as soon as the opportunity arises, as soon as the schedules of all three parties are coordinated, primarily the schedules of our American mediators, when they can devote more attention to Ukrainian affairs. We hope that this pause will be interrupted and we will be able to hold another round of trilateral negotiations. But the work of the bilateral Russian-American working group dedicated to economic aspects continues." But fortunately, Vladimir Putin's attempts to finally win Donald Trump over to his side through the topic of the war in Iran have not yet been successful. Russia made various proposals to the US regarding Iran, which were rejected. Well, for example, earlier the US rejected the proposal from the Wild Russians to move all enriched uranium from Iran to Russia. Trump firmly refused because he wants the uranium for himself. In addition, the Russians are doing everything they can to sow discord between countries, the United States of America, the European Union, and Britain as well. Well, for example, earlier this same Kirill Dmitriev stated that the American administration simply needs to lift sanctions from the Russian Federation to support global energy markets. And on the contrary, to impose sanctions against the European Union and the United Kingdom for refusing to join Trump in going to war against Iran. Well, and then Dmitriev once again decided to play the Ukrainian card. He stated that Washington's NATO allies for some reason support Ukraine but do not support the United States of America, which is conducting a military operation against Iran. Like, how is that possible? The Europeans support Ukraine but not the United States of America. Well, and he tried in every possible way to spread this idea in the American information space. He did everything he could to communicate this idea to Witkoff so Witkoff could relay it to Trump. Meanwhile, Russia expanded its exchange of intelligence information and military cooperation with Iran from the very first days of the war. Moscow provides satellite images and drone technology to help Tehran strike American troops in the region. And here, let me remind you that in a recent interview with Fox News, Donald Trump hinted at a connection between the exchange of intelligence information with Iran and Ukraine. He stated, quote, that President Vladimir Putin of Russia might be helping Iran a little bit. Yes, probably, and he likely thinks that we are helping Ukraine, right? Fortunately, the US continues to share intelligence with Ukraine, despite the reduction of any other support. Washington, let me remind you, briefly suspended information exchange. Last year, after the failed meeting between Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office, that's where we first heard that Zelensky supposedly didn't have any maps. That was on February 28th of last year. And that sudden halt in intelligence sharing by the Americans, of course, triggered chaotic infighting among the Allies and revealed deep tensions in the partnership with Kyiv. But then, in Europe, they decided to quickly reassure Ukraine. One European diplomat reminded that actually French President Emmanuel Macron had already stated back in January that 2/3 of all military intelligence data for Ukraine is currently being provided specifically by France. I don't know about the 2/3, whether that's true or not, but if we believe Macron, then 2/3 are no longer coming from the Americans, but from the French. Nevertheless, the exchange of intelligence information remains the last major pillar of American support for Ukraine after the Trump administration last year ended most of the financial and especially military aid to Ukraine. Washington still supplies weapons to Ukraine, but under a NATO program in which allies, primarily European allies, pay the United States of America for the weapons that then end up in the hands of the armed forces of Ukraine. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. You already know what to do. I would appreciate it. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone. To be continued.